The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook, Colorado, as Marcus Thompson wiped the grease from his hands and stepped back to admire his work on the old Chevy pickup. The engine hummed with satisfaction, a sound that never failed to bring him peace after 12 years of fixing things that others had given up on. At 34, Marcus had found his rhythm in this quiet mountain town, far from the chaos he left behind in Afghanistan and the nightmares that still occasionally visited him in the small hours before dawn. The bell above his garage door chimed as Mrs. Patterson shuffled in, her arthritis making each step deliberate and careful. She'd been bringing her ancient Honda Civic to him for 3 years now, and Marcus had developed a soft spot for the retired librarian who always paid in cash and homemade cookies. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson," he called out, but something in her expression made him pause. Her usual warm smile was replaced by a worried frown, and her hands trembled more than usual as she clutched her purse. "Marcus, dear, have you seen the news this morning? There's been some kind of accident up at the research facility." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same instinct that had kept him alive during 3 tours overseas. The Blackwood Research Facility sat 20 miles north of town, a government installation that most locals pretended didn't exist, despite the occasional convoy of unmarked trucks that passed through on their way up the mountain road. "What kind of accident?" he asked, already reaching for the small television he kept on his workbench. The morning news was cycling through its usual routine of weather and traffic reports, but as Marcus adjusted the antenna, a breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. The reporter's voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic as she described a biological containment breach and urged residents of surrounding areas to remain indoors until further notice. Mrs. Patterson gasped and dropped her purse, spilling its contents across the oil-stained concrete floor. Marcus helped her gather her belongings, but his attention was drawn to the window where he could see his neighbor, Bill Hendricks, stumbling across his front yard in what appeared to be pajamas. Bill moved with an odd, jerky gait, his arms hanging loose at his sides, and even from 50 yards away, Marcus could see dark stains covering the front of his shirt. "Stay here, Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said, his military training automatically taking control of the situation. He grabbed a wrench from his toolbox, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in his hand, and stepped outside into the crisp mountain air. The streets of Millbrook were unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning, with none of the usual sounds of lawn mowers or children playing in yards. An unnatural stillness had settled over the town like a thick blanket, broken only by the distant sound of sirens echoing off the surrounding peaks. Marcus approached Bill cautiously, calling out his neighbor's name, but there was no response. As he drew closer, the smell hit him first, a sickly sweet odor decay that made his stomach lurch and triggered memories of roadside bombs and aftermath scenes he tried so hard to forget. Bill's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when he finally turned toward Marcus, his eyes were milky white and vacant, showing no recognition or awareness. Dark fluid oozed from what appeared to be bite marks on his neck and arms, and his mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained with fresh blood. Marcus had seen death before, had held dying men in his arms and closed the eyes of friends who wouldn't be coming home. But this was different. This was wrong in a way that defied explanation, a violation of the natural order that made every instinct scream danger. When Bill suddenly lunged forward with surprising speed, arms outstretched and fingers clawing at the air, Marcus reacted without thinking, swinging the wrench in a wide arc that connected with his neighbor's temple. The impact sent Bill crashing to the ground, but instead of staying down, he immediately began struggling to get back up, showing no pain or awareness of the injury that should have knocked him unconscious. Across the street, Marcus heard Mrs. Patterson scream, and he turned to see similar figures emerging from houses throughout the neighborhood. They moved with the same unnatural gait, the same vacant expressions, and each one was covered in the same dark stains and bite marks. The morning news had been wrong. This wasn't just an accident at the research facility. This was the beginning of something far worse. Something that was spreading through Millbrook like wildfire, turning neighbors into predators and transforming the quiet mountain town into a hunting ground. Marcus ran back to his garage where Mrs. Patterson stood frozen in terror, her hands pressed against the window as she watched the nightmare unfolding outside. He grabbed his cell phone and tried calling 911, but the circuits were busy, overwhelmed by what must have been hundreds of similar calls from across the region. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts warning people to avoid contact with anyone showing signs of illness or unusual behavior. But Marcus could already see that the warnings had come too late. The infection, or whatever this was, had already taken hold of Millbrook, and as more figures appeared in the streets, moving with that same purposeful hunger, Marcus realized that everything he'd known about his quiet life in the mountains had just come to an end. The dead were walking in America, and the struggle for survival was about to begin. The sun was beginning its descent behind the Rocky Mountains as Marcus Thompson led Mrs. Patterson and 2 other survivors through the back alleys of Millbrook, their footsteps muffled by years of accumulated pine needles and mountain debris. They had managed to rescue Emma Rodriguez, a 3rd-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary, from her apartment building where she had barricaded herself in her bathroom after watching her landlord tear apart another tenant in the hallway. The 4th member of their group was Jake Sullivan, a 17-year-old whose parents had been among the first to succumb to whatever plague had transformed their neighbors into mindless predators. Jake carried his father's hunting rifle with the competence of someone who had grown up in Colorado's wilderness, but his hands shook whenever he thought no one was looking, and Marcus recognized the shell-shocked expression of someone trying to process an impossible reality. Emma had suggested they seek shelter in Patterson's hardware store on Main Street, reasoning that the building's solid construction and lack of large windows would provide better protection than any residential structure, and Marcus agreed, though he kept his deeper concerns to himself as he watched the shadows lengthen and multiply around them. The streets of Millbrook had become a maze of abandoned vehicles and scattered belongings, evidence of the panic that had swept through the town as the infection spread with terrifying speed. Through broken storefront windows, Marcus could see more of the infected wandering aimlessly through businesses and homes, their movements becoming more coordinated and purposeful as darkness approached, as if the absence of sunlight somehow enhanced their predatory instincts. The hardware store's heavy wooden door opened with a familiar creak that Marcus remembered from countless trips to buy supplies for his garage, but now the sound seemed echoed through the empty streets like a dinner bell, and he quickly ushered everyone inside before barricading the entrance with a display case full of power tools. The store's interior offered a temporary sense of security, with its high shelves stocked with everything from rope and lumber to camping supplies and hunting equipment, resources that Marcus knew would be invaluable if they were going to survive more than a few hours in this new reality. As they explored the building, they discovered they weren't the only ones who had sought refuge there. Dr. Patricia Wells, a retired Army medic who had moved to Millbrook 5 years earlier to enjoy her golden years in peace, emerged from the store's back office carrying a first aid kit and a determined expression that immediately reminded Marcus of the combat medics who had saved his life more than once overseas. With her was Bobby Martinez, a long-haul trucker whose rig was parked behind the building, its trailer loaded with canned goods destined for a supermarket chain in Denver. Bobby's weathered face showed the strain of someone who had witnessed the chaos spreading along the highways, and he reported that the interstate was completely blocked by abandoned vehicles and roaming groups of infected, making escape by conventional routes impossible. Dr. Wells took charge of treating the minor injuries they had all sustained during their escape, her steady hands and calm demeanor providing a stabilizing influence as the group tried to process their situation and plan their next moves. She confirmed what Marcus had already suspected, that whatever was causing the transformation wasn't natural, based on the speed of the infection and the behavior of the affected individuals. Though she admitted her knowledge of biological warfare was limited to what she had learned during her military service decades earlier. As night fell completely, the group huddled in the store's central aisle, using camping lanterns to provide minimal light, while avoiding the windows where dark shapes could be seen moving past with increasing frequency. The infected seemed drawn to any source of illumination or sound, and Marcus established strict rules about noise discipline and light management, drawing on his military experience to create a defensive perimeter using the store's layout to their advantage. Emma worked with Jake to inventory their supplies, discovering enough food and water to last several days if they were careful, along with weapons ranging from hunting knives to a crossbow that Bobby found in the sporting goods section. The relative quiet was shattered around midnight when a car alarm began blaring somewhere in the downtown area, its shrill wail echoing off the surrounding buildings, and seeming to draw every infected creature in Millbrook toward the sound like metal filings to a magnet. Through the store's small windows, Marcus watched in horror as dozens of figures emerged from buildings and alleyways, all moving with the same determined shuffle toward the source of noise. Their numbers far greater than he had imagined possible in a town of only 3,000 residents. The alarm continued for nearly 20 minutes before finally falling silent, but by then the damage was done. The infected had congregated in the streets around the hardware store, creating a mob of former neighbors and friends that now posed a deadly threat to anyone attempting to leave the building. Dr. Wells whispered that they needed to remain absolutely silent, as the creatures seemed to lose interest in areas where no sound or movement could be detected. But Jake accidentally knocked over a display of paint cans while trying to get a better view through the window, the metallic clattering echoing to the store like thunder. The response was immediate and terrifying. Dozens of pale faces turned toward the hardware store, and the infected began pressing against the windows and doors with renewed purpose, their dead eyes reflecting the faint light from inside as they began testing the barriers that separated them from the living. Marcus realized that their first night in this nightmare world would be far from peaceful, and as the infected began to organize themselves around the building with an intelligence that defied explanation, he wondered if they would survive to see another dawn in what had once been the quiet mountain town of Millbrook, Colorado. Dawn broke over Millbrook with an eerie silence that made Marcus Thompson's skin crawl as he peered to the hardware store's dust-covered window, watching the infected that had surrounded their refuge during the night slowly disperse as the morning sun climbed higher into the Colorado sky. The creatures seemed less active in daylight, moving with a sluggish uncertainty that gave the survivors their first real opportunity to escape the town that had become their prison. Dr. Patricia Wells had spent the early morning hours monitoring a battery-powered radio, picking up fragmented emergency broadcasts that painted a grim picture of the outbreak spread across the western United States. But one transmission had given them hope. A military installation near the Canadian border was reportedly establishing a safe zone for uninfected civilians, though the details were sketchy and the signal kept fading in and out of static. Bobby Martinez confirmed that his truck was still intact behind the building, and after a careful reconnaissance mission through the store's rear exit, the group decided that their best chance of survival lay in heading north toward the rumored sanctuary, even though the journey would take them through hundreds of miles of potentially infected territory. Emma Rodriguez had found a detailed road atlas in the store's office, and she worked with Marcus to plot a route that would avoid major population centers while still allowing them access to fuel and supplies, though they all understood that their planning was based on assumptions about a world that no longer existed. The escape from Millbrook proved easier than expected, as most of the infected had wandered away from the downtown area during the night, leaving the streets relatively clear for Bobby's 18-wheeler to navigate through the maze of abandoned vehicles and debris that marked the town's final hours of normalcy. Jake Sullivan rode in the passenger seat, his father's rifle across his lap, and his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape for threats, while Marcus, Emma, Dr. Wells, and Mrs. Patterson settled into the truck's sleeper compartment, grateful for protection offered by the vehicle's solid construction and elevated position. The first 50 miles of their journey took them through familiar mountain territory where Marcus had spent countless weekends hunting and fishing. But now the pristine wilderness felt contaminated by an invisible menace that could be lurking behind every tree or rock formation. They encountered their first real obstacle at the Riverside Rest Area, where Bobby needed to refuel from the truck's reserve tanks. And the sight that greeted them there would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. An overturned yellow school bus lay on its side in the parking lot, its emergency exit hanging open, and its interior splattered with dark stains that told a story too horrible to contemplate. As they approached cautiously, Emma spotted movement inside the wreckage, and they discovered a family of 4 who had somehow survived the crash and the initial chaos. Tom and Linda Henderson, along with their 8-year-old twins Amy and Alex, who had been hiding in the bus's rear seats for 2 days without food or water. The rescue operation required precise coordination, as the bus had attracted several infected individuals who wandered the rest area in endless circuits, and Marcus found himself drawing on his military training to devise a plan that would extract the family without alerting the creatures to their presence. Dr. Wells and Emma created distraction by throwing rocks toward the far end of the parking lot, while Marcus and Jake carefully cut through the bus's damaged rear window and helped the Henderson family escape to Bobby's truck. But their success was short-lived when the sound of breaking glass triggered a response from infected individuals they hadn't seen hidden in the nearby woods. The situation deteriorated rapidly when a group of armed men emerged from behind the rest area's facilities, their weapons trained on the truck, and their leader, a scarred man in military fatigues who introduced himself as Vince Crawford, demanding that the survivors surrender their vehicle and supplies in exchange for their lives. Crawford's men moved with military precision, and Marcus realized they were dealing with deserters or mercenaries who had decided to profit from the chaos rather than help restore order, their faces showing the hardened indifference of people who had already crossed moral lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The standoff lasted only minutes before Crawford made his intentions clear by shooting one of his own men, who had questioned the decision to rob families with children, and Bobby responded by gunning the truck's engine and smashing through the wooden barrier that blocked the rest area's exit, as Crawford's remaining followers opened fire on the fleeing vehicle. Bullets shattered the truck's rear windows and punctured holes in the trailer's aluminum siding, but Bobby's driving skills and the vehicle's momentum carried them onto the highway before Crawford's group could organize an effective pursuit, though Marcus knew their problems were far from over as he watched smoke rising from the truck's engine compartment and felt the vehicle beginning to lose power. The Henderson children huddled against their parents in terror, having witnessed more violence and death in the past few days than most adults see in a lifetime, while Dr. Wells worked to treat a bullet graze on Jake's shoulder and assess the damage to their transportation and supplies. As they limped along the mountain highway with Crawford's group somewhere behind them and an uncertain destination ahead, Marcus began to understand that the infected were only one of the threats they would face in this new world, and that human predators might prove even more dangerous than the walking dead who had already claimed so many lives across America. The truck's engine finally gave out 20 miles from the rest area, thick black smoke pouring from under the hood as Bobby Martinez guided the dying vehicle off the highway and into a grove of pine trees that offered some concealment from a road. Marcus Thompson could hear the Henderson twins crying softly as their parents tried to comfort them, while Dr. Patricia Wells continued working on Jake Sullivan's wounded shoulder by the fading afternoon light that filtered through the forest canopy. The bullet had passed cleanly through muscle without hitting bone, but the teenager was showing signs of shock and infection that worried the retired medic, especially given their limited medical supplies and the constant threat of discovery by either the infected or Crawford's raider group. Emma Rodriguez took charge of organizing their remaining supplies, discovering that they had enough food for perhaps 3 days if they rationed carefully, but their water situation was more critical, and the truck's damaged radiator had leaked most of their reserve supply onto the forest floor. Bobby worked frantically under the hood, his mechanical knowledge limited compared to Marcus's expertise, but even the former Marine could see that the engine block had cracked beyond any hope of field repair, leaving them stranded in hostile territory with night approaching and their enemies somewhere behind them on the highway. The forest offered temporary shelter but little comfort, as every sound seemed amplified in the mountain silence. The snap of a twig could be a deer or an infected human, and the distant rumble of vehicles on the highway kept everyone on edge as they wondered whether Crawford had given up the pursuit or was methodically searching every possible hiding place. It was Jake who first spotted the cabin, a weathered log structure nestled in a clearing about half a mile from their disabled truck, its windows dark, but its chimneys showing recent signs of use that suggested someone had been living there recently. Marcus approached the building with extreme caution, his wrench replaced by a hunting knife borrowed from Bobby's supplies, while Emma and Dr. Wells kept watch over children and Mrs. Patterson, who had grown increasingly frail during their ordeal and seemed to be retreating into herself as the reality of their situation overwhelmed her elderly mind. The cabin's front door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the mountain breeze, and Marcus could detect a faint smell with smoke and something else, the antiseptic odor of medical supplies that seemed oddly out of place in such a remote location. Inside, the single-room structure was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized, with scientific equipment scattered across a makeshift laboratory table and charts covering the walls that showed the spread of infection across the western states, marked with dates and population figures that painted a terrifying picture of how quickly civilization had collapsed. The cabin's occupant emerged from the shadows near the stone fireplace, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, but his eyes alert and calculating as he studied the armed stranger who had invaded his refuge. Daniel Kim introduced himself as a former researcher with the Centers for Disease Control, claiming he had been investigating reports of unusual viral outbreaks in rural areas when the pandemic exploded across the country, trapping him far from his Atlanta headquarters with nothing but field equipment and fragmented communications from his superiors. His story seemed credible, and his knowledge of the infection's characteristics proved invaluable as he explained how the virus attacked the central nervous system while leaving basic motor functions intact, creating the shambling, aggressive behavior they had all witnessed in the infected population. Daniel's presence brought both hope and new complications to their group, as his scientific background offered the possibility of understanding their enemy. But his secretive nature and evasive answers about his specific research raised questions that Marcus filed away for future consideration. The cabin provided better shelter than they had enjoyed since leaving Millbrook, with thick walls that muffled sound and a back exit that led to a network of hiking trails to the surrounding wilderness. But their temporary safety was shattered on the second night, when Emma discovered that their carefully rationed food supplies were disappearing at a rate that suggested someone was hoarding or stealing from the communal stores. Suspicion fell immediately on Daniel, whose explanation that he had been supplementing their meals with items from his personal cache seemed plausible, but didn't account for the systematic nature of the thefts, and Marcus began to suspect that their new companion might be in contact with outside parties who represented a threat to the group's survival. The situation reached a breaking point when Jake, despite his wounded condition, volunteered to take the night watch and reported seeing signal lights flashing in the forest beyond the cabin, apparently in response to similar lights that had originated from inside their shelter while everyone was supposedly asleep. Confronted with this evidence, Daniel broke down and admitted that he had been communicating with Crawford's raiders, providing information about the group's location and capabilities in exchange for promises of safe passage to a government facility where his research could continue. But he claimed his betrayal was motivated by scientific necessity rather than personal gain, arguing that his work might lead to a cure that could save millions of lives. Marcus felt the familiar rage that had sustained him through combat situations, but Emma's intervention prevented him from taking immediate violent action against the traitor, instead proposing that they use Daniel's communication system to mislead Crawford while planning their own escape from the cabin before the raiders could surround and capture them. As they prepared to abandon their temporary refuge and venture back into the infected wilderness, Marcus realized that trust had become a luxury they could no longer afford, and that every decision from this point forward would carry the weight of life and death for the innocent people who depended on his leadership in a world where betrayal could come from the most unexpected sources. The abandoned lumber mill sat like a fortress of rusted steel and weathered concrete in the valley below, its towering smokestacks and reinforced walls offering the kind of defensible position that Marcus Thompson's military experience told him could be held against significant odds if properly fortified and supplied. The group had discovered the facility after 3 days of hiking to the Colorado wilderness, following logging roads and game trails to avoid both the infected hordes that wandered the highways and Crawford's raiders who seemed to be tracking them with disturbing accuracy despite Daniel Kim's supposed misdirection. Emma Rodriguez had argued for bypassing the mill entirely, worried that such an obvious stronghold would attract unwanted attention. But the Henderson children were showing signs of exhaustion and malnutrition that Dr. Patricia Wells feared could prove fatal if they didn't find shelter and medical supplies soon. Jake Sullivan's shoulder wound had reopened during their forest trek, and even Mrs. Patterson's remarkable resilience was beginning to fail as the elderly woman struggled to keep pace with the group's desperate flight from their pursuers. Bobby Martinez used his trucking knowledge to identify vehicle tracks around the mill's perimeter, suggesting that other survivors had already discovered the location, and their cautious approach revealed a community of nearly 20 people who had transformed the industrial complex into a surprisingly well-organized refuge, complete with gardens, workshops, and defensive positions that covered all the major approaches to the facility. The mill's current residents were led by Captain Michael Foster, a Colorado State Police officer whose squad had been responding to reports of civil unrest when the infection swept through their district, leaving him in command of 3 fellow officers and a growing collection of civilians who had sought protection under his authoritative but fair leadership. Foster welcomed Marcus's group with the wariness of someone who had learned to balance compassion with security concerns, conducting thorough interviews with each new arrival while his officers searched their belongings for weapons or contraband that might pose a threat to community stability. The mill's interior had been divided into living areas, common spaces, and work zones where residents contributed their skills to the collective survival effort, from maintaining the generators that powered their essential systems to operating the radio equipment that kept them informed about conditions in the outside world. Marcus found himself naturally gravitating toward Foster's inner circle of advisors, his military background and leadership experience making him valuable for planning defensive improvements and training the civilian population in basic combat techniques that might save their lives if their refuge came under attack. Daniel Kim's scientific knowledge proved useful for understanding the infection spread patterns and developing strategies for avoiding contaminated areas. Though Marcus continued to watch the researcher carefully for signs of further betrayal or hidden agendas that could endanger their hard-won security. The mill's elevated position and industrial construction provided excellent sight lines across the surrounding valley, allowing Foster's people to monitor the movements of infected groups and human threats, while remaining concealed behind the facility's thick walls and reinforced windows. For 2 weeks, their expanded community thrived as new arrivals brought skills and resources that strengthened their collective ability to survive in the post-apocalyptic landscape, with Emma establishing a school for the children, Dr. Wells setting up a proper medical facility, and Bobby leading salvage expeditions that brought back everything from fuel and ammunition to canned goods and building materials. The illusion of safety was shattered when Foster's radio operator intercepted communications between Crawford's raiders and what appeared to be a much larger organization of human predators who had been systematically conquering survivor communities across the region, absorbing useful individuals into their ranks, while eliminating those who resisted their brutal authority. Crawford himself arrived at the mill's gates 3 days later, no longer leading a small band of opportunistic thieves, but commanding an army of over 200 hardened fighters equipped with military weapons, armored vehicles, and the kind of coordinated tactics that suggested professional military training among their leadership. The raider leaders' demands were simple and non-negotiable. The mill's residents would surrender their weapons and supplies, submit to his authority, and provide labor and resources for his expanding empire, or face complete annihilation by forces that vastly outnumbered their own defensive capabilities. Foster's response was equally direct, delivered from the mill's main tower through a megaphone that ensured every person in both camps could hear his words. The residents of the mill were free citizens of the United States of America, not subject to be conquered by criminals and deserters, and they would defend their community against any aggressor regardless of the odds or consequences. Crawford's assault began at dawn the following morning with mortar rounds that shattered windows and set several outbuildings ablaze, followed by coordinated attacks against the mill's defensive positions that tested every improvement Marcus and Foster had made to their fortifications over the previous weeks. The raiders moved with professional precision, using suppressing fire and flanking maneuvers to probe for weaknesses in the mill's defenses while minimizing their own casualties, clearly planning for a prolonged siege rather than a quick victory that would leave them vulnerable to counterattack. Marcus found himself commanding the eastern defensive line where the mill's main entrance provided the most likely avenue for a direct assault, coordinating fire from civilian volunteers who had never held weapons before the outbreak but now fought with the desperate courage of people protecting their families and their future. As explosions rocked the mill's foundations and tracer rounds lit up the morning sky, Marcus realized that their community faced its greatest test, and that the outcome of this battle would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of dozens of innocent people who had dared to believe that civilization could be rebuilt even in the darkest of times. The mill's main tower crumbled under the relentless bombardment from Crawford's mortars, sending concrete debris crashing into the courtyard where Marcus Thompson and Captain Michael Foster had been coordinating their desperate defense against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and reinforcements. 3 days of siege warfare had reduced their once thriving community to a handful of survivors huddled in the mill's lower levels, their ammunition nearly exhausted and their water supply contaminated by shrapnel that had pierced the main storage tanks during the second day of fighting. Emma Rodriguez worked frantically to keep the Henderson twins calm, while their parents helped Dr. Patricia Wells treat the wounded in what had once been the mill's cafeteria, now converted into a makeshift field hospital, where the groans of injured offenders mixed with the distant sound of Crawford's forces preparing for their final assault. Jake Sullivan, despite his still-healing shoulder wound, had proven himself an effective sniper from the mill's remaining elevated positions, but even his accurate shooting couldn't compensate for their hopeless numerical disadvantage as Crawford's army tightened its grip around the facility like a python slowly crushing its prey. The breakthrough came when Dr. Wells, while searching the mill's basement for additional medical supplies, discovered industrial blueprints that showed an extensive network of mining tunnels beneath the facility, remnants of the silver mining operations that had originally brought prosperity to this remote valley before the lumber industry took over decades later. The tunnels connected to natural cave systems that extended for miles to the mountain bedrock, offering a potential escape route that Crawford's forces couldn't have anticipated or prepared to defend against, though the maps were decades old and provided no information about current conditions in the underground passages. Foster made the agonizing decision to abandon their defensive positions and attempt a tunnel escape, knowing that many of the wounded might not survive the underground journey, but recognizing that remaining in the mill meant certain death or capture for everyone in their community. Marcus volunteered to lead the first reconnaissance team into the tunnels, accompanied by Bobby Martinez, whose experience with confined spaces during his trucking career made him invaluable for assessing the structural integrity of passages that might have deteriorated significantly since the mining operation ceased. The descent into the mill sub-basement revealed a maintenance shaft that connected to the original mining elevator, its cables long since rusted away, but the vertical passage still accessible to anyone willing to rappel down into the darkness using climbing equipment salvaged from the mill's recreational supplies. The tunnel entrance lay behind a steel door marked with faded warning signs about cave-ins and toxic gases, but Marcus could feel cool air flowing through the gaps around the frame, suggesting that the passage system remained connected to surface ventilations that would provide breathable atmosphere during their underground journey. The first section of tunnel stretched for nearly a quarter mile through solid rock, its walls reinforced with timber supports that creaked ominously under the mountain's weight, but appeared stable enough to support their passage if they moved carefully and avoided creating vibrations that might trigger a collapse. Marcus and Bobby encountered their first obstacle when the tunnel split into 3 separate passages, none of which appeared on their outdated maps, forcing them to make navigation decisions based on airflow patterns, and the hope that following the main passage would eventually lead them away from Crawford siege lines. The discovery of mining equipment and personal belongings scattered throughout the tunnels told a story of hasty evacuation, possibly during some long-forgotten emergency that had forced the original miners to abandon their work and flee through these same passages that now offered salvation to the mill survivors. Their progress was interrupted by the sound of splashing water ahead, and Marcus realized with growing dread that recent spring runoff had flooded sections of the tunnel system, creating waist-deep pools that would make travel dangerous for children and elderly community members, while potentially concealing unstable footing or hidden obstacles that could trap or injure anyone attempting to wade to the icy mountain water. The worst discovery came when they rounded a bend and found themselves face-to-face with a group of infected individuals who had somehow found their way into the tunnel system. Their decomposing bodies adapted to the underground environment in ways that made them even more terrifying than their surface-dwelling counterparts. These tunnel zombies moved with a blind persistence that suggested they had been trapped underground for weeks or months, their pale skin and milky eyes showing adaptations to perpetual darkness, while their hunting behavior remained as deadly as ever for anyone unfortunate enough to encounter them in the confined space of the mining passages. Marcus and Bobby managed to eliminate the immediate threat using knives to avoid gunshots that might alert Crawford's forces or trigger tunnel collapses, but the encounter confirmed their worst fears about the underground route. They would be trading the known dangers of Crawford's army for unknown perils that could prove equally fatal for their community's most vulnerable members. The sound of explosions from above reminded them that time was running out, as Crawford's final assault on the mill would soon leave them with no retreat options if they didn't commit to the tunnel escape immediately, regardless of the risks that waited in the darkness below the Colorado mountains. When they returned to report their findings, Foster gathered the remaining survivors and explained their options with brutal honesty. They could stay and fight a hopeless battle against overwhelming odds, surrender to Crawford and accept whatever fate he had planned for them, or risk everything on a dangerous underground journey that might lead to freedom or death in the flooded tunnels beneath their feet. As explosions shook dust from the basement ceiling and the sound of Crawford's voice echoed to the mill's ruins demanding their immediate surrender, Marcus watched the faces of people who had become more than fellow survivors. They had become family, bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence in a world that stripped away everything else that once defined their lives. The tunnel collapse had claimed 6 members of their community, including Mrs. Patterson, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion in the flooded passages beneath the Colorado mountains, her frail body unable to endure the combination of icy water, oxygen deprivation, and the terror of being hunted through darkness by creatures that had once been human. Marcus Thompson emerged from the underground nightmare carrying Amy Henderson on his shoulders while her twin brother Alex clung to his father's back, both children traumatized into silence by their 3-day journey through a subterranean hell where every sound could trigger another cave-in or attract the attention of infected miners who had been trapped in the tunnels since the outbreak began. Dr. Patricia Wells had somehow managed to keep most of the wounded alive during their underground ordeal, but her medical supplies were exhausted, and several survivors were showing signs of infection from contaminated water they had been forced to drink when their purification tablets ran out in the deepest sections of the tunnel system. Captain Michael Foster led the bedraggled group of 18 survivors toward what appeared to be salvation, a gated community nestled in a pristine valley that showed no signs of destruction and chaos that had consumed the rest of Colorado, its well-maintained buildings and manicured lawns creating an illusion of normalcy that seemed almost too good to be true. The community's gates opened before they could even approach, and a welcoming committee led by a distinguished man in his 50s emerged to greet them with offers of food, medical care, and permanent shelter for anyone willing to contribute their skills to the community's continued prosperity. Robert Sterling introduced himself as the elected leader of Sanctuary Hills, a planned community that had been under construction when the outbreak began and had been completed by residents who had successfully isolated themselves from the infected population through careful planning and strict security protocols. Sterling's people moved with the confident efficiency of individuals who had never experienced the desperation and terror that defined life in the outside world, their clean clothes and healthy appearance creating a stark contrast to the mud-covered, exhausted survivors who had just emerged from the tunnel system beneath the mountains. The community offered everything the survivors had dreamed of during their darkest moments: comfortable housing, abundant food supplies, medical facilities staffed by qualified professionals, and most importantly, safety behind walls that appear impregnable to both infected attackers and human raiders like Crawford Army. Emma Rodriguez found herself assigned to teach in the community school, where children who had never known the horror of the outbreak learned alongside Amy and Alex Henderson, whose traumatic experiences made them seem like visitors from another world entirely. Jake Sullivan was given training responsibilities with the community security force, his combat experience valuable to guards who had maintained their positions through isolation rather than actual conflict with the threats that roamed the wasteland beyond their walls. Dr. Wells was welcomed into the medical center where she discovered equipment and supplies that surpassed anything she had available during her military service, though she began to notice disturbing gaps in the staff's knowledge about treating trauma and infection-related injuries that suggested they had limited experience with the realities of survival in the post-apocalyptic world. Marcus accepted a position overseeing the community's defensive preparations, but his military instincts were triggered by inconsistencies in Sterling's explanations about how Sanctuary Hills had remained completely untouched by the chaos that had destroyed every other settlement they had encountered during their journey. The first red flag came when Marcus discovered that the community's impressive walls were designed more to keep people inside than keep threats outside, with surveillance systems that monitored resident movements and security checkpoints that required special authorization for anyone attempting to leave the community for any reason. Emma's suspicions were aroused when she realized that none of the community's original children could provide coherent explanations about their lives before the outbreak, their stories filled with contradictions and gaps that suggested coach responses rather than genuine memories of their past experiences. The truth began to emerge when Jake volunteered for a night patrol assignment and discovered that Sterling's security force was herding infected individuals into holding areas beyond the community's outer perimeter, maintaining them in a controlled state that defied everything the survivors had learned about the behavior and biology of the creatures that had destroyed civilization. Sterling's explanation, when confronted by Marcus and Emma, revealed the horrifying reality of Sanctuary Hills. The community maintained its pristine appearance and safety by feeding unwanted visitors and troublesome residents to the infected hordes that were kept just beyond the walls, a practice that had begun as a desperate survival measure but had evolved into a systematic method of population control and resource management. The community's residents had been conditioned to accept Sterling's authority through a combination of comfort, propaganda, and the knowledge that questioning his methods meant being designated as a threat to community security, with all the fatal consequences that such designation implied. Sterling revealed that the survivors' arrival had not been accidental. Crawford's raiders were actually in his employ, tasked with driving useful individuals towards Sanctuary Hills while eliminating those who pose potential threats to his carefully constructed paradise. Marcus realized that they had escaped from Crawford's army only to fall into the hands of someone far more dangerous, a man who had discovered that the apocalypse provided opportunities for absolute power over desperate people who would accept any price for the illusion of safety and normalcy. As Sterling's guards moved to separate the survivors and integrate them into the community's population through processes that would strip away their independence and loyalty to each other, Marcus caught Emma's eye and saw the same determination that had carried them through every previous crisis. They would not surrender their freedom or their humanity, even to someone offering paradise in exchange for their souls. The rebellion began at dawn when Marcus Thompson and Emma Rodriguez managed to breach Sterling's communication center, broadcasting the truth about Sanctuary Hills across the community's internal speakers, while Sterling's guards scrambled to contain what their leader called a terrorist attack by ungrateful outsiders who threatened the peace and security that residents had worked so hard to achieve. The revelation that Sterling had been feeding people to infected hordes sparked immediate chaos as longtime residents confronted the horrible reality behind their comfortable lives, with some defending the system that had protected them, while others joined the uprising that promised to tear their artificial paradise apart. Dr. Patricia Wells had spent the previous night secretly treating residents who showed signs of sedative overdoses, discovering that Sterling's medical staff had been drugging anyone who asked too many questions about the community's operations, and her testimony over the hijacked communication system provided the credibility that Marcus's accusations needed to turn public opinion against their supposed savior. Jake Sullivan led a strike team of former mill survivors and sympathetic residents against a security station that controlled the gates separating Sanctuary Hills from the infected hordes beyond, knowing that Sterling would use those creatures as weapons against anyone who opposed his authority, but also understanding that the only way to truly free the community was to eliminate the threat that kept everyone trapped behind walls of fear. Captain Michael Foster coordinated the evacuation of innocent residents, particularly the children who had grown up knowing nothing but Sterling's version of reality, while Emma worked to identify which community members were willing to fight for freedom and which had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they would kill to preserve the system that enslaved them. The battle for Sanctuary Hills became a three-way conflict as Sterling's loyalist guards fought to maintain control, while the infected, released from their holding areas by the rebel assault on the security systems, poured into the community seeking the human prey that had been tantalizingly close but always out of reach. Sterling himself proved to be a formidable opponent, his charismatic leadership and intimate knowledge of the community's layout allowing him to organize effective resistance against a rebellion, while positioning himself as the only leader capable of restoring order to the chaos that the outsiders had unleashed upon his peaceful society. Marcus found himself leading a desperate fighting retreat through residential streets where neighbors battled neighbors, infected creatures stalked through manicured gardens, and Sterling's propaganda broadcasts competed with rebel transmissions to the hearts and minds of people who had discovered that their perfect world was built on a foundation of murder and deception. The Henderson family had taken shelter in the community school, where Emma was making her own stand against Sterling's forces, using her knowledge of the building's layout and her determination to protect the children in her care to hold off attackers who seemed more interested in recapturing strategic positions than in ensuring civilian safety. Bobby Martinez proved instrumental in the final phase of the battle when he managed to restore power to the community's main gate system, opening the barriers that kept residents trapped while simultaneously creating escape routes that allowed both rebels and innocent civilians to flee toward the rumored safe zone that had been their original destination before falling into Sterling's trap. The confrontation between Marcus and Sterling took place in the community's central plaza, where the man who had styled himself as a benevolent dictator made one final attempt to convince the survivors that his methods, however brutal, were necessary for humanity's survival in a world where traditional morality had become a luxury that civilized people could no longer afford. Sterling's death came not from Marcus's hands, but from one of his own loyalist guards who had finally recognized the monster behind the reassuring facade, though the shot that ended the false leader's life also triggered the explosive charges he had planted throughout the community as a final act of spite against people who rejected his vision of necessary evil. The destruction of Sanctuary Hills created a massive fire that could be seen for miles across the Colorado landscape, serving as both a funeral pyre for Sterling's victims and a beacon that attracted every infected creature within a day's walk toward the chaos and noise of the burning community. Marcus led the surviving residents and his original group toward the Canadian border. Their numbers reduced, but their resolve strengthened by the knowledge that they had chosen freedom over security and humanity over survival at any cost. Even though their journey through the infected wasteland would test that resolve in ways they could barely imagine. Dr. Wells had managed to save most of the children and elderly residents during the evacuation, though the community's medical supplies had been destroyed in Sterling's final act of vengeance, leaving them once again dependent on scavenged resources and improvised treatments for injuries sustained during their escape from a burning paradise. 3 weeks later, the bedraggled group of 47 survivors finally reached a military checkpoint that marked the entrance to the Canadian safe zone, their faces bearing the scars of everything they had endured since that first morning when Marcus Thompson had watched his neighbors stumble across a suburban lawn in what seemed like another lifetime. The safe zone proved to be everything Sterling's community had pretended to be, a genuine refuge where humanity was rebuilding itself without sacrificing its fundamental values to the demands of survival, though Marcus knew that the real test of their character would come not in reaching safety, but in using their hard-won freedom to help others who were still trapped in the nightmare world they had left behind. As he looked back toward the smoke-stained horizon where America continued to struggle against the walking dead, Marcus understood that their journey had been about more than mere survival. It had been about proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, people could choose to remain human,